Fire Emblem Engage is the best Fire Emblem game since Fire Emblem Echo Shadows of Valentia. That statement is at once meaningless and inflammatory for no reason other than to illustrate that I enjoy this game a lot. Fire Emblem Engage is a fun game, certainly a deeply flawed one, but one that I enjoyed a lot. So get out your mouth and hands and let's dig in. The sweetest spring is the one in your memory, where the smell of flowers and the rustling breeze beneath the shaded tree are soft and sublime the way no flower and no breeze will ever be. The play Memory Stages in Our Hearts is the same one acted out by Fire Emblem Engage, a game of pure fan service in the most traditional manner. Fire Emblem Engage's core mechanic is summoning the spirits of past Fire Emblem protagonists to aid in a story whose beats rhyme with the tropes this series has repeated time and time again, while distilling the gameplay to a medley of GBA-era simplicity, 3DS-era skill emblem, Thracia 776 trolling, and Three Houses hubbing. Engage digs its hands through every cupboard the series has and proudly, lovingly revitalizes everything great and everything awful the series has done, ranging from exhilarating maps that force the player's hand to the worst fog of war in the series and exciting staves that promote creativity to obtuse UI. This is a Fire Emblem grab bag, and it's why the game has seemingly been received differently by those who've played much of the series, those who've only played Three Houses, and those who are completely new. Engage is Frankenstein's monster, an intimidating mass of ideas from across the series, but like Frankenstein's monster, its expression of those ideas is more elegant and imaginative than its creator, at least in terms of gameplay. If you've played one Fire Emblem, you've played them all to a certain extent, and if you're a fan of Fire Emblem's tactical gameplay, you'll feel right at home here in Engage. There are three major changes to the standard Fire Emblem formula. The first is that movement has been reduced. All infantry units have a base movement of 4 spaces, mounted units get 5, and those only go up by 1 at promotion. Many people initially saw this as an attempt to bring the game more in line with Fire Emblem Heroes and its small maps. It's hard to say if this is true, but the effect is positive. Used to games like Shadow Dragon, where base movement for units could be as high as 10, I was initially put off by the low movement. I thought it would make maps slow, reduce creativity, and clump every formation into a big ball of death. The latter is kind of true. The low movement does result in more blobs than I'm used to, but the game carefully builds around this. Forming up into a big ball of death has almost always been a winning strategy in Fire Emblem, but it's frequently a broad stroke strategy. In Engage, the way you construct your Kaga rectangle matters a lot. Supports are only active when 2 units are adjacent to each other. Many personal skills require specific sets or combinations of adjacent or near-adjacent allies. The new backup ability, which allows some classes to join in on an attack, requires careful placement and movement order to fully take advantage, as does the use of weapons like daggers, which lower a target's defensive stats. Also, the one-tile-wide choke point is nearly extinct. As a result, you can't hide your army behind a beef tank and let the enemies thin themselves out. You have to be careful how you arrange your defensive positions and in what sequence you do it. Defensive position for the enemy's turn matters a lot because the second major change, the introduction of Break, makes enemy phase bulldozing harder for an individual unit. Break is the reintroduction of the weapon triangle into the series, and the way it works is simple. If the defending unit is at weapon triangle disadvantage and they get hit, they don't get to retaliate, and remain broken for an additional round of combat. It's criminally powerful, and it benefits the enemy just as much as the player, since enemy weapon types are much more varied than in previous games, or At least I noticed weapon variety more because of how important Break is. When Break was revealed, there was concern that it would be broken, and it is, but it's not as overpowered as one might think, as its power has a knock-on effect with attack sequencing and strategy. For one-rounding is difficult in this game compared with other Fire Emblem games. A lot of the abilities present in Engage would be entirely useless in games like Sacred Stones or Path of Radiance, where enemies are more threatening in aggregate than they are individually. HP gets out of control in Engage, and bosses all have 2 or more health bars that must be depleted. I'm working on a separate video talking about bosses specifically, so I won't belabor the point here, except to say that backup attacks and breaks are strong, but also necessary to bring down the bulky enemies that haunt the grounds. Going nuclear is an option, and certainly total obliteration of the game's enemies will be easier as more tech and weird meta is discovered, but the most powerful tools in the game are the Emblem Rings. Emblem Rings are the third major change to the gameplay, and they allow units to sync with previous Fire Emblem protagonists. It stands. With these stand powers, you get boosted stats, abilities, and an engage attack where you absolutely unload on an enemy, or have a psychotic support skill. Some of these, such as Marth's Lodestar Rush, Erika's Twin Strike, Micaiah's Great Sacrifice, and Byleth's Dance of the Goddess, are powerful. Others aren't so much, but it's generally massive damage attacks that always hit and avoid retaliation. The special properties and attacks of the rings are fun to mess with and to mix and match throughout your army. Even the rings that aren't the most useful are a lot of good, wholesome anime fun. They're also central to the plot of the game. Engage is simply a Fire Emblem game about stopping an evil dragon from eating the planet. Standard stuff, and wasn't all that unexpected. Engage is a celebration of the series, and why not riff on the standard Fire Emblem story? To stop the evil fell dragon, the player must take control of the good divine dragon, Alir. Alir travels the world, builds an army, trusts a dangerously large number of people, and seeks out the 12 emblem rings to put an end to the fell dragon's terror. As far as MacGuffins go, the rings work well because they give you stand powers, and also because obtaining them is not linear. After Chapter 10, the evil, dark lord, fell dragon Sombron takes all your rings, and in Chapter 11 uses them against you. Much like how Break is equally powerful for both sides, the enemy also gets to partake in using emblem rings throughout the game. Sadly, you don't get the rings back immediately. You must start from scratch and claw your way back to getting all the rings Sombron stole, plus all the remaining 12 rings you've yet to get. There is a lot to love about this. For one, with the exception of Thracia 776 Manster Arc, Fire Emblem games are almost exclusively linear climbs up. Outside of certain special maps, there's never moments where your power is significantly culled for a long period of time. You're always getting stronger. Except here, where the game pulls the rug out from under you for a very long time. The game gives you one taste of what being a fully operational battle station is like, and takes it away. You want all your toys back? First, prove you don't need them. It also forces the player to experiment with and get to know the latter half of the emblem rings without them getting crowded out. Much like how mid-game Fire Emblem units sometimes struggle to get deployed over old favorites, it's easy to imagine players just kind of ignoring the Lucina and Corrin and Erika rings if they're competing for attention with old favorites during the deployment-starved mid-game. It gives those rings a chance to shine. It also throws the character building portion of the game into complete disarray. To the dismay of fans who fell in love with the character building of Fates and Three Houses, Engage has rolled back player control over builds. Three Houses characters were mostly blank slates that had to be constructed with attention to the smallest minutiae and optimization. Developing skill sets, weapon ranks, and promoting was a project for each character. It ballooned the runtime of the game, but it was, for some, incredibly rewarding. However, it ground the game to a halt. This pressure was released somewhat by New Game Plus, but it's easy to play the game for 300 hours and never beat all 4 routes, which was my experience. Engage rips all this additional time out by limiting characters to a personal skill, a promoted class skill, and 2 inherited skills. The inherited skills are purchased using SP that's gained in battle and can be bought from the Engage rings. As a character's bond with a ring increases, they can buy higher level skills from that ring. It sounds grindy, and the SP can get that way if you want crazy high-level stuff, but bond levels can be purchased using the essentially limitless bond fragments that the game pours on you. Essentially, creating a new build or completing one takes a couple of menu clicks instead of the hundreds of clicks and many hours it takes in 3 houses. While I think that SP should work more like skill capacity in Radiant Dawn, where it's a resource that can be spent and refunded, this system is an overall improvement on the fun loop. You no longer have to waste time grinding out class masteries or putting characters through bizarre classes and awakening fates to get optimal skill combinations. Even the act of reclassing is simplified. Since characters can't transfer class skills to another class, reclassing no longer requires grinding out supports or weapon ranks. Instead, like with inheritance skills, you dump bond fragments into a ring to get access to its weapon type for another character. Making Vander into a Mage Knight has never been easier. However, your access to these tools does not linearly increase. When you lose your rings after Chapter 10, you also lose access to inheriting all the skills from those rings until you get them back. For some players, this sucks. But me personally, I'm an asshole, so anytime a game shits on the player and tells them to deal with it, it's something I almost always love. Funnily enough, Chapter 10 is probably right around the time that the player is finally getting enough SP to get cool stuff. Despite such minor setbacks, skill inheritance creates a snappy experience that never bogs down from trying to tediously build characters. I'll never miss mastering Brigand for Deathblow. Not that it's perfect, the game is still bogged down by a bunch of small inconveniences and the Somniel, and the story itself gets sickeningly verbose by the end. But the gameplay loop itself is streamlined practically and thematically. The major criticism of 3 Houses was the game's zealotry towards the monastery. Pre-time skip, post-time skip, time-sensitive missions, it didn't matter. The game forced the player to spend a month in the monastery with such strictness that it made a game about growth feel static, as the gameplay loop rarely expanded or retracted in meaningful ways. The Somniel is still largely a waste of time. It's a far cry from the efficiency of My Castle or the Tellius base. However, it doesn't force itself to the degree of the monastery. Many of the activities, from exercising to wyvern ride and card reading, are truly optional. A new player will likely feel compelled by FOMO to do as much as they can, but once you let go, ignoring most of the Somniel isn't a special challenge the same way ignoring the monastery and tutoring was in 3 Houses. It's a cold compliment to say that a game's major feature is good because it's optional, but it is nice for those who want to indulge, while it also doesn't have to impede the pace of the story. The story certainly does enough to impede itself, and it does not need the Somniel to help. Here is a scene from later in the game. Spoilers until the timestamp on screen. This is a more aesthetic argument, so we won't break down the content of the scene in depth. Rather, I want to focus on the length and style of the scene. This is a late game scene. Here it is at super speed. At 7.5 minutes long, this scene is flat, a series of repetitively animated 3D models wavering back and forth with the camera senselessly moving left to right or slow zooming to make the dialogue appear more dynamic than it is. Obviously, there is some variation as everything heats up, but for the vast majority of this scene, and many others like it in the game, it's flat. This is an issue of presentation that gets more tiresome the longer the game goes on for. This problem also affected 3 Houses, and it's one that seems doomed to stay. The market prefers 3D models over sprites, and we are all the worse for it. In Shadows of Valentia, the cutscenes in the game mostly happen between 2D portraits that have numerous variations. While these portraits are theoretically less dynamic, they are, by virtue of their stasis, more detailed, more varied, and more imaginative. The more movement and animation, the lower the quality becomes, and the more uncanny. If you want to see a good example of this, check out the demise of poor King Hyacinth. Had this been carried out in a more minimalist style with sprites, it would have been fine, but the awkward dialogue pacing, spacing, and immobility of the characters makes it just not land with the intensity and terror that it should. This problem is exacerbated by how long scenes in the game get by the end. In summary, there's too much, and it's too flat. The long, drawn-out, flat cutscenes are a problem during the late game. Engage gets away with presentational blandness early on. Many of the early cutscenes are more brief and tongue-in-cheek, while the middle arc is more adventurous as your army travels around the world to find all the MacGuffins. The playfulness of the first 15 chapters makes it a romp, and makes its more intense moments play with a soap opera glee. By the end, the game becomes serious and is played entirely straight, which lessens the game's strengths and highlights its flaws. For example, if we look at the 4 hounds, the recurring villains we fight over and over and over and etc. again, we see how long-winded repetition can turn otherwise effective scenes into bathos. This shot is good if excessively sentimental, but it's undone by just how long the preceding scene is and how often we've had to fight and beat the shit out of the hounds. The story as a whole just kind of collapses by the end into a miasma of exposition, long-winded dialogue, and repetitive boss fights, and this burden is borne by the presentation because the Fire Emblem loop has almost always been story, gameplay, story, without a whole lot of crossover. Much like Awakening, which serves as a sort of spiritual predecessor, the game falters when it must inevitably shift from fantasy opera to high fantasy dead serious. The explanation, I think, is pretty simple. It's 50-hour JRPG syndrome. If your game is a massive investment, the overwhelming temptation is to deliver something grand to avoid players from feeling like their time was wasted. But look, if Persona 5 taught us anything, it's that you can waste 20 hours of the player's time with a big ol' smile on your face and the player won't care as long as they keep having fun in any variety. And fun really is the optimal word here. The story, packed as it is with unnecessary prose, is fun for its first 2/3, and the gameplay is fun from beginning to end. And there isn't a whole lot more you can ask for, especially from a game like Engage. As a celebration of the series, Engage stands firm for everything great and exhausting in this tri-scenarian series. It could go down as the Fire Emblem game of all time, and to that I say, eat up.